acknowledge the way rural America exists if you don't acknowledge where the land came from, right? So American Indians have lived in what we consider America today for thousands of years. Settlers arrived and dispossessed those people of their lands through a variety of means: violence, treaties, sort of trickery in a lot of ways, a bait and switch sort of process. So rural America would not be the same if we hadn't had so much land available to the country. Anecdotally, I was just this past weekend, I visited the Whitman Mission site in Walla Walla, and their interpretive signage there was a comment that the missionaries helped the American Indians build fences and establish land ownership. Problematic, a problematic choice of words, which I believe was probably, these signs look like they were from the 70s, so I give them credit that I think they probably will redo them when they get money, which is another problem the park system faces. For a different day. Then we have the Homestead Act, which again totally changed the face of rural America. It gave people the opportunity to establish land ownership under the American definition. 160 acres were available if you could improve the claims. Now, of course, what we believe, or what we think of when we say the Homestead Act is this, right? A hardworking family goes out and they build a house, a sod house, and they're really scratching a living. These are the yeoman farmers that Thomas Jefferson was talking about. There were many, many people who claimed homesteads simply to get the land and then sell it to a company like the railroad companies. In our part of Idaho, that actually happened quite frequently. People would claim, they would claim homesteads, sell the timber, sell the land to the railroad companies, and move on. And then changes to the way we practice agriculture and also other extractive industries. But as technology improves, people can farm more land, more people can, you can have bigger tracts, that sort of thing. So technology is a really important changing factor. Then we have the development of industrial processing of rural goods. So this is a meatpacking plant. Very famously, Upton Sinclair wrote about the meatpacking district in Chicago in the jungle. But all those cows the cattle had to come from somewhere. Hogs, chickens, all of that. So as factories can more efficiently process the goods coming out of rural America, there's more incentive to produce in rural America. It's a self-generating system there. This is kind of an interesting one, Teddy Roosevelt. We're at the turn of the century now, 1900, 1908. Teddy Roosevelt is the president, and he's having a lot of anxiety that people living in the cities are getting to be soft. Young boys are growing up, and they don't know what hard work is. They don't have any calluses on their hands, never been bucked off a horse. And so he promotes this country life movement where he's saying you should go back to the land. And even if you're not going to live out in the countryside, out in rural America, you need to visit it. And of course, he famously establishes our first national park, which is a place that urbanites can go to visit rural America and be rejuvenated by the powers of rural America. This is a great cartoon. It says, when TR will have improved social life on the farm. It's a cow in a tuxedo. That's pretty funny, but this is obviously, from the perspective, critical of this idea that social life on the farm could be improved. Again, we're country bumpkins out on the farm. What do we think improved life is? Dressing our cows up. I will say, incidentally, have any of you seen the fabulous picture from the University of Idaho Dairy Barn, where they had a dinner in honor of their prize-winning cow? It was like a turn-of-the-century photo. Anyway, they're in the dairy barn eating dinner at this long table, and there's a cow with a flower wreath on its head at the far end. It's a fabulous picture. Improved technology gets more people into the rural areas faster. It allows for communication. It allows for travel back and forth. The car allows people to visit the national parks, or the train does. And if you look at the history of communities in Latah County, when the train arrives, that's when those communities flourish. Moscow, Genesee, Troy, all of the above. Then we have the Great Depression. certainly a major force of change in all of America. Rural America feels it because they can't sell their commodities if they're farmers, because corporations that might have employed them as miners or railroad laborers are shutting down. And of course, the double catastrophe of the Dust Bowl in the central United States has far-reaching effects. I will say, as you look through oral histories, as I've studied the Great Depression in Latah County, the folks who seem to have fared the best were the people on the farms. They always had something to eat, and that I think is true even of rural communities. There was more abundance in the region versus living in a large city. Civilian Conservation Corps built a lot of important infrastructure in rural places, park, lodges, roads, bridges, all sorts of things. And then the post-war boom of industry and the factory lines, and this is where we first see kind of the first big brain drain from rural America. Young men who went off to fight in World War II decided not to come home. They stayed in the cities and went to work in factories because they were able to use skills that they had acquired while they were in the military. Technology comes to the farm. That's a big component. If you visit the exhibit downtown, there's a really great conversation about rural electrification and how important it was to bring electricity into rural communities. I think we can see similar parallels today as we struggle to have access to high-quality internet, how essential it is. So when the radio becomes ubiquitous in America, it really becomes a problem if you don't have access to it. Similarly, when high-speed internet is available to folks in the city, it puts us at a disadvantage in rural areas. The civil rights movement. Now, I think when we study the civil rights movement in school, your basic high school history class, we have a tendency to focus on what's happening in big communities. And the reality is so much legwork was done in the rural South, in communities where people dared to try to register to vote, where they decided to sit in at their local lunch counter. And there was an incredible amount of activism that occurred in rural communities. And it wasn't just the civil rights movement for African Americans, it was the farm workers movement, also in the 60s. Women in rural communities were starting to organize in the 1960s for equal pay, for access to better education opportunities, all sorts of things. The Back to the Earth movement, or Back to the Land movement. And there are folks who arrived in Idaho, I think in the 70s, as part of the Back to the Land movement, but people were realizing that there's a lot of value to living in rural places and growing your own food and having your toes in the dirt. This was coupled by the farm crisis of the 1980s. I'm actually a Midwestern girl, and so the farm crisis of the 1980s still loomed over the heads of a lot of the folks that I knew when I was growing up in the 90s. So a lot of people lost their farms, and when you speak with economists today, they're fearful that we might be on the cusp of another one of those rounds of farm consolidation and loss, as farmers have borrowed against future crops year after year, and crops are not performing in the ways that were expected. Certainly in the Midwest, record flooding this year led to unsubstantial yields for a lot of farmers, and that's gonna just be a snowball effect, I think. And industrial agriculture, again, as somebody who grew up in Iowa, the growth of animal confinements has really changed the landscape of rural America. There are a multitude more confinements growing hogs and turkeys in my home community of Story County, Iowa, than there ever were 15 or 20 years ago. So it's really changing how rural farmers are growing product. So finally, And maybe this is a little bit of a swing, but I do think that more and more rural communities are seeing that alternative energy is a place where they could grow their local economy. Solar panels, wind farms, all of those places need big open spaces where there aren't buildings around. And so rural America is a perfect place to cultivate some of these renewable energy resources. And the back to, a resurgence of the slow food locavore movement. And we see that probably no better place in Idaho to visualize that than at our own farmers market. So that brings us up to today and where we are now. Does anybody know where this is? Genesee, yeah. So if you do visit the Smithsonian exhibit downtown, I hope that you'll take a few minutes to look at the walls. There's a photo retrospective exhibit that's up alongside the Smithsonian piece, and it is then and now photos of Latah County communities. And when you see the historic image of Genesee, this whole street is lined with 2- and 3-story buildings. So rural America, even in Latah County, we can see the changes pretty drastically. So I wanted to share a few more really interesting insights from this Life in Rural America report that was prepared by NPR and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So again, the survey was conducted in 2018, and the purpose of it was to understand the current views and experiences of rural America on economic and health issues in particular. So during a period where there's a great deal of national focus on the economic problems of rural America, this survey finds that rural Americans identify drug addiction and abuse, including opioids, as well as economic concerns as the 2 biggest problems facing local communities. What do you all think? If you were responding, what would you identify as the biggest challenges facing our rural communities? Climate change. Yeah.
Affordable housing, childcare,
Jobs, the economy in general.
wireless connections.
Uncontrolled growth.
Uncontrolled growth, okay. Unplanned building.